Good morning and welcome to the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District Training. I'm Laura Kwesky, Senior Environmental Planner with the Office of Planning and Environmental Analysis, or OPIA. We are pleased to have Karen Huss and Ollie Othman of the district staff conducting the training for you today. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly tell you that this training will provide you with the information and tools you'll need to assess air quality and greenhouse gas impacts for projects where discretionary decision is to be made by DTSC. This training augments the guidance provided in our CEQA informational bulletin on greenhouse gas evaluations and CEQA documents and OPIA's internal review process. Now I'd like to introduce Karen Huss, Air Quality Planner Analyst, and Ollie Othman, Program Coordinator of the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District.
So this is the outline of the topics that we're going to touch bases on this morning with you, what the SMAQMD is, general air quality information, a little bit on CEQA because we know you're fully trained on CEQA, what SMAQMD sections are involved in air quality analysis, and then a lot more detail on the analysis or assessment of air quality, and then demonstrate some modeling tools. We have authority through the Health and Safety Code, and we've been around since 1960 as part of the county, and then in 1988 we became a special district. We've been around 54 years. Originally the focus was on stationary source control of emissions, although now we see a bigger part of our air quality problem is related to mobile source emissions. Our mission is to achieve clean air goals by leading the public health and the environment through innovative, effective programs, dedicated staff, community involvement, and public education. So some of the training we're doing today meets a lot of these mission statements. You guys also work with various levels of regulation. While we are under the Federal Clean Air Act and the Federal EPA, and then the California Air Resources Board is an umbrella agency with the California Clean Act, and then we, as the local air district, as a special district, we do CEQA review, permitting and inspections of industrial source, complaint response, public education, and we work under our local rules that stem from the two larger acts. A little bit more about air quality information in general. Our two biggest pollutants of concern in Sacramento are particulate matter and ozone precursors, which are VOC and NOx. So we're providing a little bit of a visual here showing that the PM, more than half of our PM problem in the winter is from residential fuel combustion. So we're talking about wood smoke from our homes. And then the VOC and NOx problem, generally a summertime ozone problem, dominated by mobile sources in the NOx as far as 80%. And VOCs, we have quite a bit of contribution from stationary sources and consumer products, coatings, pesticides, stuff like that. So we have to know what emissions we're dealing with so we know how to reduce them. We do have standards, federal standards and state standards of healthful air. And this is just a little excerpt from showing the ozone standards and the particulate standards, both the California and the national ones. And there's a good link on this slide if you want to get the full array of pollutants. In Sacramento County, we monitor the air to see if we do meet the standards. That's when we know if we have to act and figure out how to reduce the pollution. So the little black circles on the map are our different monitoring stations. And each monitoring station may monitor for different air pollutants. They don't all monitor all of them. It's too expensive. As far as Sacramento County meeting those federal and state standards, we are non-attainment for the federal and state ozone standards, and we are non-attainment or not meeting the state particulate standards and the federal 2.5 particulate standards. But we've made great progress. We are in the process of doing an attainment, or showing that we actually do attain the 2.5 standard, but we're right on the edge, but we're doing all the planning work to show that we can continue to meet it. This particular slide, if you need this for any of your documents to show the air quality in Sacramento County, this is available on our website. This is a map showing our non-attainment areas. The yellow and black big outline is the federal ozone non-attainment area. You can see that. And then the red outline is Sacramento County, and that generally shows our any particulate matter non-attainment. So we'll pass the map, and then once we monitor the air and figure out what we're non-attainment for, we work on plans. And I know you guys are all used to government paperwork, but we have in process or in place ozone attainment plans for the federal and state ozone standards, PM10 maintenance plan, and a PM2.5 maintenance plan in progress. We are still considered non-attainment for 2.5 right now. We'll switch over to a little bit more of CEQA, which you all are familiar with and have to deal with regularly like we do. So as we're all familiar, Public Resources Code, CEQA law requires us agencies to consider environmental impacts of a project and reduce, avoid, or mitigate the impacts prior to approving it. And the guidelines are available in Title 14 of the California Code of Regulations. You guys are fortunate to have an exemption just for you and some of your work for hazardous waste cleanup sites. But we do want to stress that when you use it, it's really important that you document how your project meets that exemption, because I'm sure there's some details in there. Make sure you document it, so if anyone does question your notice of exemption, that you have all of the documentation and you won't be challenged. In addition to the Class 30 exemption, I understand a lot of your work may fall into the general rule exemption, and again, just document how it meets the general rule exemption. It makes your notice of exemptions more foolproof. I understand that you're required to actually file them with OPR, which is a great thing, because if you do file them, your statute of limitations is a lot shorter, 35 days versus 180 if you don't file or post them. So if your project doesn't qualify for the exemption, then you need to do the initial study, and Appendix G gives a great example, and I'm sure you've made your own based on that. Prepare the appropriate documents, a negative deck or an EIR, do the public noticing and review requirements, and then certify your document, prepare your findings, adopt your mitigation, and approve the project, and then do your notice of determination. The sections of the SMAQMD that are involved in air quality assessment and in CEQA review are the Stationary Source Division and the Land Use and Transportation sections. And just in general, our Stationary Source Division is responsible for rule compliance, permitting requirements, and inspections. And our Land Use and Transportation section have some very specific direction in the Health and Safety Code that pushes us into the CEQA project review process. We're supposed to be trying to influence decisions of agencies whose actions may adversely impact air quality. So, of course, we're interested in seeing DTSC's projects and making sure that air quality impacts are reduced as much as possible. And in project review, we review development and construction projects, and we identify or assist in identifying air quality impacts from the analysis and recommend mitigation. And oftentimes we also go out and ensure mitigation is being monitored. Sometimes we monitor it ourselves. And right now, I'm going to change places with Ollie so he can talk more about stationary sources.
Good morning. My name is Ali Othman, and I work for the Stationary Source Division at SMAQMD. And we have about 8 engineers that do permitting and about 12 inspectors that do compliance inspections. So here's an overview of what I'll be going over. Namely, we're going to go over the types of sources we permit, the permitting process, toxic and health risk assessments, and then CEQA in the permitting process for stationary sources, and then also the toxic hotspots program that deals with existing sources and what their toxic or health risks are. So going right into the types of sources that we permit, in each district has its own unique industry and sources, and primarily in ours, these are the most common. We have about 33% engines, 19% boilers, and then gasoline dispensing is about 13% of our permits. and air pollution control equipment, 8.4, auto body, 4.7, and then there's the numerous others. I listed a few of the more common ones, such as some water remediation, concrete plant roasters, and graphics art printing operations. So basically, the sources still amount to about, we have about to operate that are active. Applications in process, we have about 20 change of ownership applications on a regular basis, and 350 parties to construct. I'll be covering the application process, engineering evaluation, authority to construct, initial inspection, and the permit to operate. So basically, the permits are required via our Rule 201, which lists all the exempted standards or thresholds for permit requirement. So for engines, it's over 50 horsepower. For boilers, it's 1 million BTU or greater. And surface coating operations, a gallon a day. And other exemptions are,
we just want to make sure that you respond with a letter.
It's kind of a more general exemption. If you don't have a category of the exemption, then they fall under a 2 pound a day permit. If that's exceeded within a 24 period of operation, then a permit is required. And the last way that a permit could be required is if there is toxic level of warrants regulate that risk or get it under acceptable risk threshold. And our de minimis levels are greater than or equal to 0.1 in a million cancer risk and a hazard index of greater than 1. All right, so getting into the application process, we do have application forms and fees that need to be submitted for any permit that is required for whether it's a project or a process or individual unit. And we have 30 days to determine that application complete. So if it's not determined complete, we send it back, and once they resubmit the information, that starts another 30 days of review for us to determine it complete. And once we do determine it complete, we have 180 days to make a final action, and that's whether to deny or issue the authority to construct. Once we start the review process, we look at the new source review rule, and here we look at potentials to emit, whether BACT is triggered, whether offsets are triggered, and we review compliance with local, state, federal regulations, toxics, and CEQA review. So I'll get into each one of these sections shortly. So getting into engineering evaluation, first step is to determine the potential to emit. So here you have the property line on the left side, and we need the characteristics of the building, of also the building close by to the source, and then the stack parameters, exhaust flow rate, temperature, etc., diameters of stacks, so we can assess and model the emissions. We look at, namely, our criteria pollutants, which are the ozone precursors, NOx and VOC. Then also we have sulfur oxides, particulate matter 10 microns or less, and PM2.5, and carbon monoxide. So here I'm showing here a table for one of our sources that is a particulate source, and again, we determine their daily emissions, their quarterly emissions, and annual emissions, and then we determine whether they trigger any further requirements. Okay. Going forward, the other emissions that we look at are the toxic emissions. So, here's a list of a bunch of toxics, and I think these emission rates here are listed as an example for a crematory and all the levels that are emitted on an annual basis. We also look at hourly maximums for toxics for determination of acute hazard indexes compliance. Within the new source review, we have to determine if best available control technology is triggered. And so here we have a table that shows the daily potential to emit from the project. So here are emissions for an engine. And these are our criteria pollutants again. And we also look at lead. We have a threshold for lead, which is 0. Historical daily potential to emit, if it was permitted previously, and this is a modification, there would be numbers here in this column, but in this case, this is a brand new application. And then we look at the net emissions increase from this project, and we make the determination that triggered. So here's listed in this column is all our back thresholds for all these pollutants, and if they exceed them, back is triggered, and we have to determine whether they meet back or not. So once we determine that, then we get into whether the emission reduction credits are required. Listed here are offset threshold levels for those criteria pollutants, and they're pretty low. These vary from district to district depending on their attainment status, etc. And this is what we've adopted in order to meet our attainment. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with emission reduction credits, but they are basically credits, or it's kind of a mitigation, basically. We have a bank where we maintain the credits that were banked by facilities that made reductions or eliminated processes and banked those emissions. And like I said, the next thing we look at is the local, state, and federal laws. We have prohibitory rules, which are our 400 series rules at the SMAQMD. Here we'll look at such things as whether visible emissions are met, or if sulfur content for fuels are met. And these prohibitory rules apply to whether you have a permit or not. So you could have an exempt process or unit, but they would still have to comply with these prohibitory rules. And the other rules that we look at are the ATCMs from the California Air Resources Board, New Source Performance Standards, and then also the NESHAP, the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants. Besides all that, we also look at toxic space, best available control technology, and whether that's triggered or not, and whether it's met. So our trigger levels for TBAC are if the project emissions have a potential to exceed 1 in a million, cancer health risk, and then also a non-cancer hazard index of greater than 1. So whether it's acute or chronic. And the toxics that we look at are, whether they're HAP, TAC, and examples of those are listed here. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. Chromium for crematories, benzene, diesel, diesel particulate, hydrogen sulfide, etc. And we do have a state rule that requires us to do public noticing if any of these projects that have a toxic risk potential, that we have to do public noticing if these projects fall within 1,000 feet of a K through 12 school. And that all comes at the applicant's expense, unfortunately. So delving into the TBAC determination, we get into do an evaluation, do a health risk assessment on the project. And so we evaluate the potential for human exposure. We look at the OEHA RELs and guidelines. And we use a dispersion model, which is ISCSD 3, the most current version. So that stands for Industrial Source Complex Short-Term Model. And so here we're showing the stack on the bottom right here, and the exhaust dissipates into the neighborhood. And from the analysis, we determined first is what the cancer health risk is, and here we're showing isoplex of the emissions from the source. I think the green part right here. No, I think the source, probably somewhere in the center of this isoplex here, the blue one, and it radiates out, and it gets less concentrated as it goes out. So this one here actually shows the cancer risk. We do have some where we only show the concentrations of pollutants as they radiate out, and from there we can determine the cancer health risk per individual toxin. And furthermore, we look at the chronic risk, and similarly, here you have the isoplex or the chronic risk. And lastly, we look at the acute risk, the 1 hour standard, or based on 1 hour of maximum potential to emit, what the acute risks are. So within that evaluation, we estimated all the cancer risk and the non-cancer risk, and then we determined whether they are compliant with our toxics policy. The district's policy on toxics is TVAC is required if a process has a potential for exceeding 1 in a million cancer health risk, or being over 1 or over acute or chronic hazard index. And a lot of times what happens, some projects come in and they do exceed these levels, and we either negotiate to get them below these levels, whether they take add-on control or limit their production or process rates, etc., or operating hours. And we can get these risks down to where they don't trigger TVAC and they're compliant. But if they do exceed the 10 in a million threshold, then we usually deny the project.
I do have a question. Yes. If you have more than one source, would you evaluate the cumulative effect or the total risk from two or more sources?
We look at it as a project. So if it's 2 engines and 2 boilers, we look at the whole application as it comes in for that.
So let's say that there's one site where they're going to put in a new project, but there's already an existing project. Would you look at the total risk?
Yes, we do look at total risk from existing processes and new proposed processes. But there's a caveat here. If it's pre-year 2000, that's when we first implemented our TVAC standards or thresholds, and so anything that was permitted prior to that never underwent any real toxics review. So we can't include that within the whole project risk.
Okay.
So we're looking at the added risk since 2000 primarily.
Okay, great, thank you.
So you're saying that the previous 2000 does not have to be assessed?
Well, I'll get to that later. It is assessed, but more in our toxics hotspots program, which brings a lot of these sources to these levels, back down to these levels, which we're deeming acceptable. But that's for existing permitted sources, and it's ongoing. We keep an inventory of all the sources and their toxic risk potential. but that's based on actual risk. So actual hours of operation or process rate. Whereas this analysis here that we do for an authority to construct deals with potential. So we're looking at the worst case process rates and worst case annual emissions, and also the life of the projects, because some of these projects might be short term, and then we only look at maybe 7 years of a project versus 70 years over the lifetime of a person that's exposed to these toxins. Then the final part of our analysis deals with the SMAQMD determination. So I'll get into the SMAQMD, but basically our role and responsibility as an agency for such projects is broken down into 3 categories, whether we're the commenting agency, responsible agency, or the lead agency. So most of the time we're never the lead agency. I think in my tenure at the district, we've only had one project that went through a full-fledged SMAQMD review. So getting into the commenting agency portion, which is the least involved for us, basically a lead agency will notify us and ask us whether it requires any comment from us on the project, and whether it goes to our planning department or stationary source department. We both make that determination and submit comments. Most of the time, a lot of these projects are exempt from our SMAQMD review. But as a commenting agency, of course, we're not entitled to any compensation for any of the work done there. So that's taxpayer dollars, I guess. The second role could be as a responsible agency. I'll list all these out first. So under this, then the SMAQMD will issue discretionary permit for a project, and other agencies act as the lead agency. So we consider the EIR negative deck prepared by the lead agency and do research and give conclusions, and whether we approve or deny the project. And again, we don't get compensated for this either. And the third role could be as a lead agency, and this is the most involved. And here we list all the responsibilities that we have for performing this SMAQMD review. Basically, determine the risk, and then notify other agencies for their comments, etc., and prepare a negative deck or mitigated negative deck, EIR. But at least in this, the lead agency, you can get the cost recovery, so not out of our pocket. And then within that analysis, we determine whether a project is exempt. So here's the categorical exemptions, or categories for exemption. There's the statutory exemption, categorical exemption, or general rule exemption. And here it gives the definition of each one of those. So within statutory exemptions, most of our projects fall within these categories, this category here, and the primary one further is the ministerial project. We do have, permits to operate, change of ownership applications, replacement equipment, small projects, permit renewals, but then the majority of our authorities to construct fall within these permit manual procedures, permitting procedure manual category, and we publish those and have them on our website. And the categories are for IC engines, boilers, coating, operations, soil and water remediation, wood products coatings, gasoline dispensing facilities, and dry graphic arts, sand and gravel operations, and coffee roasting. And then also we have other statutory exemptions could fall under the category of emergency projects, air quality permits, ongoing projects that were previously approved, and then also a disapproved project. And this one is another one that deals with application coding for automotive manufacturing plants, which we don't have any within our district, but there are some within California. Then the second category is the categorical exemption from CEQA, and that falls into these categories again: existing facilities, and this is modifications to equipment resulting in basically negligible emissions changes, or the installation of air pollution abatement equipment. So whatever they're doing, they're most likely reducing their emissions or just not changing anything, or they could be just doing a conditional change, so it doesn't increase emissions. Then you have replacement or reconstruction, so they might replace the boiler, so there's no net increase in emissions or even toxic, so we're not too worried about those. Action to protect the environment, that could be required either as from a prohibitory rule requirement, or it could be a federal state requirement also. Another category is the cogent projects as existing facilities. So this is looked at favorably because you're reducing greenhouse gases from your power production and using the steam for alternative uses also. And then you also have cleanup actions like Superfund sources, et cetera, or even remediation of soil and sludge or water. So these projects are subject to the categorical exemptions, may still be subject to CEQA if they're located in a particularly sensitive environment. So we look at whether environmental justice is triggered or not for such projects. And we also look at the cumulative impact of the project of the same type at the same location if it's significant. There are also unusual circumstances that may cause a significant effect. So it doesn't always get you out of it, but there's possibilities where CEQA could still be triggered. And getting into the general rule exemptions, we have new unmodified sources with emissions below offset threshold levels. I listed those earlier. And each district within California has their own offset levels, so we look at those differently. And within there, we have the new and modified projects with criteria emissions below offset thresholds and toxic emissions that conform with the AQMD's risk management policy. And I'll get into that policy a little later. Another one under general rules is the new and modified sources offsetting emissions increases. So this is, again, a mitigation process. They're providing emission reduction credits, so we don't look at that as an increase necessarily, since it's being mitigated. So, but again, we also look at the toxic emissions, whether they conform with our risk management policy. So again, these, even though you're exempt under general rules, you could still be required to, could still be subject to CEQA if some of the other extenuating circumstances require it. So we do have a form that we've developed, the CQ 100, and that kind of gives you a checklist of to determine whether CEQA is triggered for your project or not. So there are specific questions asking whether anything is required that is increasing a risk or not. And again, it'll answer directly to them whether CEQA is required. It's pretty simple question. And the last part could be required is if the project is a major modification. And for us, major sources are if they're over 25 tons a year for our NOx and VOCs, and 10 tons a year for a single HAP, and 25 tons cumulative per year for all HAPs. All right, and we've developed a flow diagram of within the application review process for determining if CEQA is required. So you start off on the top here with the permit application, and you work your way through, yes or no, answer all these questions, and you get down into those exemptions categories and determine if they're, they fall under any of those. If they don't, then you're going to trigger CEQA, and you have to get into the whole process of doing the EIR, et cetera. So again, within here, we do have established thresholds of significance. And I think Karen might be getting into that a little further in her presentation in a few minutes, but I also listed them. But for us, the majority of our permit actions fall just above this line here. 99% of them are exempt from CEQA. So getting into the thresholds of significance for stationary sources, we're looking at ozone precursors if the emissions are 65 pounds a day or greater for VOC and NOx. We do have one. I should note here that it's a proposed threshold for greenhouse gases, and that's at 10 tons a year, metric tons a year, CO2 equivalent. And other pollutants, we look at does the project result in operational emissions that could lead to violations of any applicable state ambient air quality standards. So CO2 could be modeled to determine if those standards are being met or not. We don't really have too many projects that are that big to where they could affect the state ambient air quality standards, our attainment of that. So we haven't had too many major sources come to the district in the past 10 years, I'd say. Everything's been around here for quite a while. And also, we look at the toxic air, or the thresholds we have for toxic air contaminants are, again, 10 in a million cancer risk and 1 less than or greater than 1 hazard index. And we also look at cumulative toxic air contaminants for projects that are in close proximity to existing sources that are identified in our AB 2588 hotspots program as being high risk. And then we determine if the risk from that project is greater than 10 in a million in addition to the neighboring project or facility. And that could trigger a CEQA review. So here's the table summarizing all these thresholds. And again, I want to point out this CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas threshold is proposed. We're in the process of getting all that approved by our board and making it official. And again, here you have the toxic air contaminant threshold listed, so all summarized. Like I said, most of these projects, once we determine compliance with all the rules and regulations, and if the risk is within acceptable levels, if toxic specifiable control technology is triggered or met, then we can go ahead and issue an authority to construct. And after we issue the authority to construct, the facility has 2 years to complete the project. They can petition for an extension of up to 2 years to keep the authority to construct active, but they have to have good enough reasoning, whether it's delays in getting permitting from other agencies. We've had that happen quite often recently. So we can extend them up to, so a total of 4 years for an authority to construct. So within the authority to construct, we will have permit conditions. So once we've issued the EC and they've contacted us, construction's complete, then we do an initial inspection, and this could require also a source test. A lot of our boilers are required to have testing even at 1 million BTU and higher. If they're not in compliance with those permit conditions, then we might issue a notice of comply or a notice of violation, and then you try to settle all that and then as a permit. If we've issued a permit and its source is not in agreement with the conditional approval, then they could petition our hearing board, or after a permit is issued and maybe something is just not attainable for them, they might request a variance if it's under special circumstances that qualify under the variance definition. And again, that's also to our, the variants are approved by our hearing board. Every district has the same process. Once we've satisfied all the fees are paid, all the conditions are met, then we issue the permit to operate, and they have to continue to comply with the permit limits. And this permit is good for 1 year. We bill annually, and they renew it by paying their annual renewal fees. And then field staff takes over in this to do annual inspection and determine, again, if compliance is met, issue notice of violation, and try to settle all those. And so now that we're in the permitting stage of ongoing operation, we do look at toxics under our toxic hotspots program, and this was by Senate or Assembly Bill AB 2588, and it requires us to do inventory our sources and get actual toxic emissions inventory for these sources. We take those and we assess the health risk from these toxic emissions and for each source, and then we determine whether they have to do a risk reduction plan, and we do have the thresholds for the notification are if the source exceeds 10 in a million health risks, and if they are over that, then they have to do a risk reduction plan, and but we do have to notify the public within a certain distance from the facility, and they have to provide us with a plan over the next 5 years in how they're going to reduce their risk to get within below the 10 in a million health risk, and also I forgot to mention the acute and chronic hazard index of 1, so they have to meet all those. But that's, again, this is for permits to operate. So
I have a question. For your emission reduction credits, what is the cost of that within the Sacramento Air District? And then what is it in other districts, if you know?
Sure. It varies depending on pollutants. The most, I don't want to say the expensive ones, but it's a free market, so it's really established by how much somebody wants to pay for it. We do keep a record of the transactions and kind of keep an average of what credits cost, and we publish that on our website also. I'm going to say about a ton of emissions for 1 year, and usually the ton is good for the life of a project, or you could prorate it depending on how long you need the emission reduction credits for. But for NOx, which is our probably most in demand pollutant to be mitigated, it could cost about $35,000 a ton or more. There's been much more. Again, that's the average. So, and some of the other pollutants could be in the $10,000 range and higher.